Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Do I Need a Bigger Mouthpiece? A podcast where we talk all about brass pedagogy, and the classical music world. My name is Alex Knutrid. This is another one of those solo episodes. Kevin is away today, still tending to the duties of being a new father, and I thought I would record this. So I was really excited to lay down this track and talk about teaching, specifically private teaching, which is a big part of how I make my day-to-day trombone impact. I'd say, 85% of my income right now comes from teaching studio lessons. And it's something that I've worked really hard at to build a community where a lot of people can put their trust in my teaching to develop as musicians as well as technicians. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I have accomplished that, what things I've learned along the way that work and don't work. And I'm going to focus a little bit on Zoom teaching, meaning teaching online from your home and the benefits and drawbacks and how to balance that, because I'm sure many of you might be interested in this kind of an opportunity for your own personal career. So, a little bit about how I do teaching. Well, I teach online. Many people know this, but for those that don't, I run a studio called the Trombone Guide Studios. It's all based around my Instagram page, Trombone Guide, and my website, tromboneguide.com. This entire kind of space was created in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. And my original goal was never to turn this into a big brand ecosystem, but rather just to supply quality pedagogy for free to people that needed it. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of people that were young and starting their trombone journeys or their low brass journeys. And I was concerned that with the advent of the pandemic and many people staying at home, there would be a lot of gaps in the education that young students would get on the trombone specifically. The trombone is not like other instruments. We don't have keys, we don't have buttons. It's an entirely different set of motor skills, and it's actually not a fine motor skill instrument, but a gross motor skill instrument. We're using the slide, and that requires larger muscle groups than just fingers. And so, because of that, the ability to translate education on trombone over Zoom, particularly when Zoom was at its infant stages at the beginning of the pandemic, was challenging. And if you're a clarinetist and you're a music teacher and you have to teach flute, there's a lot of cross-curricular skills there, and your ability to teach beginner flute is going to be a lot easier than it is teaching beginner trombone. So to this end, I was really concerned about what the future of our community would look like if we had a big gap caused by the pandemic. And keep in mind, at this point, none of us really knew how long the pandemic was going to go on. We hoped it would be a short blip, but we didn't know. And so my goal with Trombone Guide originally was to create recordings of elementary band instructions so that people could just access them for help. That obviously ballooned into something much bigger, but that was not my original intent. My original intent was to be a servant of the community for a short time, and then for Trombone Guide to disappear after the pandemic, and I could go about my orchestral career and move on. What ended up happening was I became really passionate about teaching, and Trombone Guide grew into a pedagogy presence in the community that quickly outpaced me. And now it has provided me with a way to access so many students all around the world. And I think that's really a beautiful thing. And that's kind of the first benefit to Zoom teaching. Teaching online gives you the ability to reach people all over the world. In the first year that I was teaching, my studio was comprised of students from New Zealand, Norway, California, and a military base in North Carolina. With 4 students, that was my beginning placement, and only through Zoom could I reach these 4 people. Pretty spectacular opportunity, I think. Another benefit to Zoom teaching that I think can't be overlooked is the ability to access your computer at all times while you are teaching. And let me be a little bit more specific about what I mean. When you're teaching on the internet and you have access to your hard drive, you can multi-window so many different tools. You can allow students to see your files with metronomes, with drones, with recording devices, you can use whiteboard technologies to mark music in real time. You can pull up YouTube recordings. All of these things can be done at the same time if you set up your system to be able to do so. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be super easy if your students are on their iPhones sitting in a band classroom, as some students will do, but if you set parameters for what your students are required to bring to their Zoom lessons, and you have a system where everybody has expectations of mic requirements and technology requirements, and you meet those as well, and you can then build out a system that makes sense for your students to be able to read off of and you read off of, it gives you access to technology that you wouldn't normally have. I think this is not to be overlooked as a tool. Now, there are, of course, drawbacks. When you teach on Zoom, there's a delay. And that delay definitely can be frustrating if you want to jump in and help a student as they're trying to work through something. It's very difficult to sing and snap. It's very difficult to play along with a student on Zoom. These are all things that are challenging because of the delay. I won't lie, for the first year, I found myself pretty frustrated by them, but your teaching methodologies can evolve to adapt to those, which mine have. I now am a lot more thoughtful about when I jump in with a student. I let them play a little bit more. I plan what I'm going to say when they stop playing. I don't speak over them while they play as much. And then I also have moments where a student will be playing, and the Zoom delay is about a second or three-quarters of a second. I will say to them, if you hear me talking over you, just keep playing. I'm giving you instruction as we go. And I will call out instruction as they are playing occasionally. Now, obviously, it's much better to be in the room with the student for this sort of work, but every system has trade-offs, and the boons versus the costs are definitely things that which you can think about and understand that there will always be trade-offs. As opposed to teaching in person, where you're right there and you can react quicker, but you're limited by what you can carry in. You have to travel to the student, and the students that can study with you are limited to those that live near you. Those are real limitations, right? Anyway, let's talk a little bit about how to build a studio and what really goes into this. Principally, building a studio starts with one bedrock foundational element, and that is good teaching. When you begin as a teacher, the single most important thing above everything else, the technology, the scheduling, the way you advertise yourself, everything else comes second to your quality of teaching. And you have to accept the fact that when you begin teaching privately, you're going to suck at it. This is because education, being able to be an educator, is a skill set. It is different than being a performer. You can be the world's best oboist, but if you're not good at translating oboe concepts to a young person so that they can understand them clearly and communicating with them, you're not going to necessarily make a very good teacher. And this is, of course, why people that are educators and people that are performers, primarily at least, don't have a ton of overlap in the middle. There are lots of people that teach at the conservatory level that are performers that have learned to teach pretty well because they are interested in it or because it's something that they have to do as part of their job or whatever. But they did not study education. And so most of their training comes from on-the-job learning. Conversely, people that are experts in education may not have the technical knowledge or musical knowledge required to teach at the highest levels, but they're incredibly good at distilling concepts so that people can understand them and process them clearly. Each side of this coin is something to be studied if you want to be a teacher. And specifically, if you want to be a very successful private teacher, you have to have a very high level command of the instrument. So that's the performance side. But you also have to have a very high level command of the translative property of teaching, which is taking concepts, distilling them and explaining them 25 different ways so that all students can understand them. That's also a different skill. So let me tell you a little bit about the things that have helped me do that. First, a degree in education from Ithaca College. When I went to undergraduate school in 2007, Ithaca College was ranked the #1 music ed school in the country. I was blessed to get a degree there. I was blessed to study under some of the greatest educators at the time, educators like Steve Peterson, Beth Peterson, Mark Fonder, Dan Isbell, Susan Avery. These are some of the names that I got to work with in the education department. And then I was mentored by the late Dan Fabricius, who is probably one of the greatest band directors to ever walk this earth. Rest in peace. I think I was incredibly lucky, but studying education from these people shaped the way I thought about teaching, and it's important to understand that there's no substitute for teaching experience when you're trying to learn to teach. This is often why young students get frustrated when they start teaching private lessons. They wonder why they can't get students. They have a master's degree in performance or even an advanced degree like a certificate, and they're trying to advertise online studios or in-person studios, and they're just wondering why students don't want to study with them. And it's hard to discuss with people the possibility that their educational pedigree is not there yet. They just don't have the experience yet. And that takes time. So there's a patience factor here. You have to be the one to grow, to change, to get better. And that's a reality. And I remember when I started teaching, when I first got out of undergrad, I was teaching in the public schools, both as a band director, but also as a private teacher. I was really cocky. I thought my education was great. I thought I really knew what I was doing. And I knew a lot of what I was doing, but I didn't have a lot of experience. So I was learning on the job with a chip on my shoulder, having this degree from this wonderful program. It's an interesting place to be because if you teach in a public school, you very quickly learn that if you're a young teacher, older teachers kind of look at you with a smirk because they remember the energy and excitement that you have and all of the go-getterness, but they recognize your nuanced inexperience. They remember that feeling. And there's no substitute for experience in teaching. There just isn't. So to that end, I have to I have to start by saying you need to cultivate your educational chops. There are a lot of things you can start reading. You can get books on educational psychology. You can get books on teaching. You can get books on social and cultural foundations of education. These were like the big seminars that I took in undergrad. Social and cultural foundations of education is so important because it talks about diversity and how students from diverse backgrounds learn differently based on how they were brought up to receive information, under what circumstances they best learn, under what circumstances they have trouble learning. How to connect with students is the secret to really being able to translate information well. So I recommend doing a lot of reading in this area. There are also really good seminars on YouTube you can watch for free from very experienced teachers. There's a lot of professional development that exists for teaching because teachers are required to do professional development. So the amount of material that you can find on your own is quite endless, and I recommend that you begin. That is the first place to start, is learning to be a better teacher. The second place to start in terms of building a studio is understanding that your job is to provide value. It would be a wonderful world if we could say that the reason every student takes private lessons is because they love music, and music for music's sake is the only reason that we should have lessons. So to that end, you can charge a living wage to teach a music lesson to 20 students a week, and you could pour yourself into it and everything will be fine. That's just not realistic. At the end of the day, we live in an economy where everything is a goods and service economy, and we live in supply and demand goods and service restrictions. And what I mean by that is a student that comes to you for lessons to buy a product, and that product is your teaching. So you have to ask yourself, why are they buying that product? And what is the quality of the product I'm offering? So we've just spoken about why good teaching is paramount and the value of good teaching as opposed to, okay teaching from a really good expert. I'm not saying you're not an expert. You could be an expert at your instrument, but you're maybe not an expert at teaching your instrument when you're young. Even if you've done a lot of study, even if you studied with great teachers, even if you have a lot of experience in like going through school as a student, you're still very inexperienced as a teacher. And that's a reality that you have to face. At the end of the day, your job is to provide a product. So let me give you a few examples here. Your student is 16. They are from a pretty affluent town, and they're interested in taking private lessons. They come into the first lesson, and they don't seem to care very much. They play at a decent level, and they're getting better, but they're just not excited. And then they leave, and you get check from the parent, and they come back the next week, and it repeats and it repeats. Eventually you start to get confused and you say, well, why are you here? Like, let's look for projects. Maybe we could do like an all-state audition. Maybe we could chase this. Maybe we could make tapes for this. And they're just not interested. Well, that student may be in lessons because they would like to be in lessons, but they're not necessarily committed to it, and their parents are very committed to it because it's important to show diversity of interests on their resume when they apply to college the next year. Maybe that student is in lessons because their parents are making them and they're trying to be polite to you, but they don't want to be there. There could be a bunch of reasons. Understanding the motivation for what the product you're supplying is important, particularly when it comes to things like pricing. I think that what has helped me be successful, where others maybe have not been, is that I have defined my market niche carefully. My function, my teaching on Trombone Guide Studios is entirely for accelerated and advanced high school students that are looking to apply to undergrad, or undergraduate students that feel like they need a little bit of remedial technical help to apply to grad school. And a big part of my teaching is coaching towards the process of going to school. In this way, students know what they get from me. Therefore, students who are looking to get those things know to come to me. This is important. It's important to think this way because as a small business owner, which is what a teacher is, you really need to be able to corner and define your market niche. I teach trombone lessons just to anybody that wants to play the trombone. Okay, that's great. But why would somebody study with you as opposed to the kid down the street who is, a high school student that's charging $30 an hour for a lesson? Why would they come to you? Well, because I'm a better teacher. Well, I know more. Okay, but why does the parent care if their goal is just to have their son or daughter in lessons so that they can say that they're in lessons because they need to be in lessons? The answer is that it doesn't really matter. Your product will not sell itself in that situation. You will not attract students because you have not defined the function of what you're providing in the market space. And that's a kind of frustrating reality of how teaching works at the private teaching level, but students are looking for supply and demand. Now, let's use a different example. Let's pretend that you are the principal trombone in the Atlanta Symphony. I'll use this example because there currently isn't one right now. If you are the principal trombone in the Atlanta Symphony and you're teaching trombone lessons in Atlanta, you have defined exactly what your product is. You are the principal orchestral player in the city. Students will come to you for lessons if they wish to be orchestral trombonists and live in Atlanta. As simple as that, you have defined your parameters. If you begin offering lessons, you can charge a lot of money. Let's say $120, $150 an hour for a lesson. That's expensive for lessons, but they're paying for your expertise. You're not going to get freshmen in high school that are just interested in having fun with the trombone and getting better. Those are not the students you're going to attract in that scenario. You're going to attract seniors in high school in Atlanta that would like to apply to go to conservatory. You're going to attract undergraduates who have moved back to Atlanta that are looking to improve their playing so that they can find professional work or go on to graduate school. And you're going to find older students that are taking orchestral auditions that are looking for your ears to listen to excerpts. Those are the people who are looking to buy the product you are selling, which is education from someone with your pedigree. Do you see how that works? That's an example of how the supply and demand of the market works in teaching. So, if you're trying to build a studio, one of the first things to do is ask yourself the question, what do you do? I'll give some examples. I'm Julia. I'm a clarinetist. I have a master's in clarinet performance. My job is to teach, and I want to build a studio. I'm going to focus on middle school clarinetists that would like to get better and want to work in an environment that is fun, that makes music fun, and also makes students feel seen and safe and makes the process of getting better painless. Okay, you've just cultivated a really warm community feeling. Your studio is all about support and taking students that maybe don't always feel safe in lessons or a little nervous and making them feel really comfortable. That's a wonderful market. That's a wonderful thing you're doing. You're doing a lot of good. You're going to get lots of students. They're all going to be middle schoolers. Parents are going to love to send their students to you for lessons. And what makes you the product you're selling different? Well, tons of things. It's a really unique cross section. Let's try another example. I'm a percussionist. I have an undergraduate degree in performance and a double degree in music production from a school that does both of those. Let's say like University of Massachusetts Lowell, a really great program for that. I am looking to teach percussion lessons to high schoolers, and specifically, I will teach you orchestral percussion skills, but I also teach rock drum set really well. So if you're a high school student and you want to learn to play in a band, but also build your chops to be able to take district or all-state auditions, I'm the guy to come study with. Wow. I mean, that's a niche right there. You're going to have a very full studio. You do things other people don't. You see how this works? We're creating niches. If you are, if you have a DMA in trombone and you live in a state in the South, you're teaching how do you separate it from other people? Well, there are a lot of people in the South with DMAs in trombone, and they all play pretty well, right? Like, I mean, you could say, well, I'm a really good player. Yeah, so is everybody with advanced education at that level. That's not something that's going to differentiate you. So things that can differentiate you are specializations in education. So maybe you're very, very knowledgeable in DCI drum corps. This is a specialization that you can study. If you have connections to the drum corps world, if you've written shows, if you've planned marching, if you have coached as like a brass tech for any of these marching bands, that puts you in a really interesting place where you can teach and design your pedigree and pedagogy around teaching students to play comfortably on the field in healthy ways that will set them up for success in the DCI world. Suddenly, you're recruiting a different kind of student. And P.S., all these students need lessons. Everybody is looking for lessons. They're just looking for the right fit for them. You have to provide value. So this is a really long-winded way for me to say what I'm trying to say. Let's talk about pricing. So when you price your lessons, you're in a unique situation when you teach online. And that is that you can access students from anywhere. The problem with that, or the challenge that that creates, is that you are competing in markets where other teachers can undercut you. For example, I charge $100 for a lesson, and many of my students are in Texas. Most of the teachers in Texas charge considerably less than I do right now, as of 2024. And to that end, oftentimes when students would like to take lessons with me, the parents say to them, well, why would we study with this guy when we can pay less for these lessons in person? That's a totally fair question. Again, it goes back to value. What are you getting that you don't get from somebody that is cheaper? And to that end, I have lots of answers, and I have a pedigree of what makes my studio different and what, market I try and target, and exactly why students would want to come study with me as opposed to somebody else. Those are all really true things. But pricing yourself in a situation that is realistic to your skill set, realistic to your experience, and realistic to your cost of living is important. In an honest way, the market can fluctuate, right? So your supply and demand numbers can fluctuate. If you have 20 hours a week to teach and you set your rate too high, you might only get 5 students. If you lower your rate a little, you might get more students. But if you lower your rate too much, you get too many students and you don't have time. And also, there's a break point where it doesn't make sense to teach more students for less money, right? If you're teaching for $100 and you have 10 students, is it better to teach 15 students for $50? No, I mean, you're making less money and you are having to focus your attention on a broader swath of students. We all have finite amounts of attention that we can put into students. But what if it's 15 students at $75 each? Well, that is technically more money, but you're losing a lot of time and you're spreading your energy thin. So, to this end, I recommend that you think about exactly how many students you want to teach. And then you think about what the market cost for an hour lesson is in your area. And then you think about what a market cost lesson is for an hour of a teacher of your pedigree and, experience level. And then you think about what you need to be able to pay your bills where you live, like the amount of money that you need to get, bare minimum. And this is, of course, after you look at the finances and you say, well, I'm not trying to get rich here. I need to make this much to pay these bills. I would like a little bit more, but it's not necessary to break even, especially as you build a business at the beginning. You're probably going to be taking losses, and that's normal. And then you take those 3 factors and you stick the needle right in the middle. And that's what you charge. So I'm in a very fortunate position now, many years into doing this, where I am paying all my bills teaching and playing music, which is lovely. But for the first 4 years, 5 years of teaching, I was not, if I'm being entirely honest. I had other jobs. I was I was probably making about 50% of my income, 60% of my income teaching. It takes a while to build the brand. It just does. Because your successes speak louder than anything else. So to that end, you need to be willing to invest the time in building a community yourself. It takes time. There are going to be failures. You're going to have moments where you just feel like you're working very hard and you're not making enough and you're giving tons of your time. That's all part of the process. These are the early years of building a teaching mechanism that will run itself and allow you to continue teaching and eventually only teach and to make your living off of music, which is a wonderful place to be, I must say. Okay, so we've talked about pricing. Let's talk about policies. Any functional studio needs to have policies that keep things running. Anybody that is taught privately knows that whatever you project you're going to make in a week, you really only make 75% of that because students cancel lessons. Now, lesson cancellations are a complicated topic, right? Because many students that cancel lessons cancel for very reasonable reasons. Something comes up, there's a conflict with the family. And of course, if you're teaching middle school or high school students, you have to recognize they're not autonomous human beings. They don't control their schedules, their parents do. So that can happen. Getting sick is a totally reasonable reason. A trombone breaks. These are all reasonable things to cancel a lesson over. But you need to have a policy in place to guarantee that you get paid. These are the different things that I've seen work, and then I will tell you what I do. I've seen teachers with relationships with students say, even if you cancel a lesson, I have a retainer fee. Meaning, if I charge $75 for an hour lesson and you cancel, you still pay me 25 just to hold that spot every week. And that 25 guarantees that even if you cancel, I'm not going without completely. I think that's a reasonable thing if your retainer fee is low enough. I don't personally do it. I have thought about doing it. I think it's reasonable, but in the rest of the industry, across the board of like small contract positions, many businesses do not do that. If you cancel an appointment for an oil company to come to, fill your tank with oil, they don't charge you a retainer fee. Now, this is because the oil company is big and can handle that financial loss. They have a budget to be able to deal with that shortfall, and you don't as a new teacher. But you have to remember that as you're building a business at the beginning, it's possible that your choice to try and charge a retainer fee could dissuade parents from choosing you for their students to study with. So that could impact your recruiting numbers. Another option, which is I think a nice middle ground for this, is to use a cancellation policy of 24 hours. Meaning, if the student cancels 24 hours or ahead of time from that, you don't charge them. But if they cancel within 24 hours, you charge them the full amount. This is what I use in my teaching, and I think it's really effective. Naturally, I'm still going to lose money because there are going to be situations where students cancel lessons for totally valid reasons, and they don't really realize that then you don't get paid. And that can be difficult when you build a budget. My best advice to you is to assume that whatever you think you make on paper, you actually make 75% of that. And so to that end, when you calculate how many students you need 25% more students. I'm sorry, 33% more students. A total of 70. Your operating is 75% of your assumption. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, that's a good way to put that. So other policies that can be really helpful. A termination policy, not cancellation, termination. If a student chooses to no longer study with you for whatever reason, I like to require 2 weeks heads up. Whether that be that a student pays for 2 lessons or takes 2 final lessons, that 2 week period and 2 weeks of money gives you enough time to allow your budget to take the hit of losing a student, and it gives you time to try and find a new student to fill that spot. If you're teaching really well, generally you will know when a student is going to quit because they're not going to quit on you. They're just going to age out. They're going to graduate and they're going to be done with lessons. They're going to move on when they graduate. Like these are predictable outcomes. So you'll know they're coming and you can budget for them. Recruiting is always based around how many students you're losing, unless you want to grow your studio, like actively add hours of teaching to your week. So to this end, this is all just awareness and managerial, and some of this does come with time as you get better and better. Recording. When you record a student's lesson, you are protecting them and you are protecting yourself. This is really important. We live in 2024. Whenever adults are working with minors, there should be a level of accountability on both ends, just in case. It is just a safety precaution, particularly because minors cannot always advocate for themselves. So make it a habit to record every lesson. Make it a habit to host those lessons online on a drive that the student or the parent or both and you can access and nobody else. I make this mandatory for my studio. I record every lesson. And of course, it's very useful pedagogically for your students as well. If they can go back and watch a lesson recording every week, it means they don't have to be trying to fervently take notes in the lesson. They can go back and digest that recording at the end of the lesson during the week, and it helps with their preparation. This accountability is so helpful, and it's a huge boon to your teaching. There are many ways to do this. You can use invisible YouTube links that are basically videos that can only be seen by your students, or you can host them on a drive. I host my students' information on a Google Drive, which, every student has access to a folder. And I just have a giant network of folders for all of my studio. This is the best way I've found to do it. Everybody has their own tool, but I think it's important. And, if you're Zoom lesson teaching, it's very easy to do these recordings. If you're in person, you do have to schlep a camera and a microphone, but I still think it's worth it, both pedagogically and for safety measures. But from a pedagogical standpoint, if you're recording your students' lessons, it does justify you to be charging a little bit more money for that lesson because you're providing them value. You're providing them a lesson, but you're also providing them a resource, and that's good to know. Let's talk a little bit about balancing your life to make sure that you can have a life in addition to teaching. Teaching is an all-encompassing task because you are a small business. You don't get sick days, you don't get paid days off. These are all things that happen as a result of you running your own business. If you are sick, you are likely to teach through it because if you don't teach, you don't get paid. And if you don't get paid, you don't make your bills. That's a problem. And the best solution I've come up with that has been recommended to me is following the 30-day cycle. So many employers, when you start a new job, give you a paid day every 30 days building, so if you work for a year, you get about 12 days off in America. My friends in Europe are laughing right now because it's so little vacation, but that's about what you get. 12 to 15 days off is very typical in America for a first job. So to make that real for us, you basically need to teach for about 25 to 30 days before you've earned a day off to make that equivalent. So I recommend calculating what you make in a day. If it's $200, $300, $400, divide that number by 30. So that takes you to about 10 or $8 to $12 a day, and automate $8 to $12 of your paycheck into an account automatically for every day. You just begin accumulating money in this. You should be automating your paycheck into lots of different places: a retirement account, an emergency fund, a fund for your car, any of these other things as an adult. This is not a money lecture, but you should definitely have an account that you can automate money to for sick days. You're basically paying yourself and banking money for time off. Because if you can have an account that accrues $250, $300 after 30 days, and you decide you want to take a day off or you get sick, you can just pay yourself out of that account. And it's basically a sick pension fund or a day off pension fund that you've created for yourself. This can go into your calculus for how much to charge per hour. If you can create a rate that allows you to charge this much money such that you can add $10 a day into this account, it's going to make your life easier because you don't ever have to worry. If you get sick 6 months into teaching and you get really sick and you have to take 2 days off, you're not going to sweat it. You just pay yourself out of that account and you move on with your life and you take the days off. To this end, while we're talking about the finances of teaching, I highly, highly recommend that you automate 20% of your income automatically into a different account for taxes. As a small business owner, you have to pay taxes. The tax rate for what you're teaching is probably going to be between 20 and 23%, somewhere in there in America. And you're going to have a lot of tax write-offs as a small business owner teacher teaching from your house. Most notably, the room you're in can be written off as a home office. So the portion of rent, if you take a rent deduction off your taxes, that will take you to around 20% from 23 at least by itself. So then past that, you can make other deductions, and there are plenty of them. But like if you put 20% of your earnings aside, you're going to be safe. That's a safe number to bet on. So to this end, I highly recommend just making it a habit to automate 20% of what you make into an account. I do this automatically. When I teach for $100 an hour, I keep 80. 20 goes into an account that is for the taxes. And it's just a really smart way to begin. And at the end of the year, when you do your taxes, if you hit a point where you have a lot of tax write-offs and you have a lot of deductions, and you end up with a big lump of cash that you don't have to pay for taxes, then that's just like getting a tax refund from working for an employer. You then get that money at that point. So it's the easiest way to do it that I have found. Again, not investment advice, just a true story of how I do things. Let's talk equipment. If you're teaching on Zoom, you need to invest some money in your setup. It does not work to just teach from a laptop in your home. That is not a recipe for success. The most important thing is that students can hear you play. And it's hard for students to hear you play when you are in your home and they're in a different state or country or anything. So out of the gate, you need to get a microphone, and you need to get user interface, and you need to get all of the accoutrements that are required for that. For me, I use a ribbon mic. What you're hearing me on right now is an R10 made by the Royer company. It's a ribbon mic. It's a really nice ribbon mic. It's quite expensive, but it is Royer's bottom of the line mic. And this is a $600 microphone, and their specialty is picking up individual acoustic instruments. So like a single guitar, a single trombone, a single vocalist. The Royer ribbon mics are second to none. And this microphone allows my students to hear my sound close to natural. You need an interface if you're going to use a real microphone like this. I use a Scarlett 8i8, which is just like all of the rest of the Scarlett Focusrite interfaces. This allows for up to 4 different microphones in 2 individual channels. I use it for as many as 3 microphones at a time, but right now I'm just running 1. And then with a ribbon mic, you need a cloud booster because you need to be able to power it with phantom power. And you cannot just put phantom power directly into a ribbon mic because you'll fry the ribbon. So I'm using a cloud booster to keep my ribbon mic safe. So hardware here, the Focus is about $500, the cloud booster is $200, and the mic is $600. I've got a couple cables, I've got a boom stand, and that's my audio setup. So I'm in it for about $1,000, and that makes my sound pretty good for students to hear. Then there's the video side. I use a Sony digital camera. This is a DSLR. The exact number that I use, this is a Sony XV1. And they're basically designed as USB streaming cameras in high def 4K. This guy here, I think, cost me $700. Again, these are all business expenses, so they can be written off your taxes. You're using them primarily for business. Between this camera and this mic setup, my students can get high quality video of me and high quality audio at the same time. There are lots of great softwares you can play from. Zoom does a pretty decent job, but it does condense the different bars of sound on the upper and lower end. So if you want something better, you can buy a subscription to FarPlay. FarPlay is kind of like Zoom, but it is much faster and it has no delay. It was developed, I think, in 2022. The downside to FarPlay is that it only works on laptops and desktops. It does not work on mobile. So FarPlay is far superior to Zoom. But if your students are working in lessons from school, what that means is that they cannot use FarPlay because they're not on computers. They're on phones and tablets. So again, this is a problem. In terms of the other end of the spectrum, student technology, you need your students to have a microphone that is high enough quality that you can hear what's going on. And that microphone needs to be affordable and something that they can move around, something that's portable and not destroyable. I have found that the best options are the Zoom H2N, the Zoom H1N. These are 2 microphones that can be attached by USB. They're both very affordable. We're talking sub 150 for each of them, and they're somewhat interchangeable for this use. A student having a high quality camera is not as important. A wide angle shot from a tablet or from a phone works pretty well. Making sure that your students understand how to enable original sound on Zoom is a really important step that can sink a lesson pretty quickly if you don't go through that. Enabling original sound on Zoom is really simple. With a computer, you just change it in audio settings, but on a tablet or a phone that's on mobile, you have to do it in the meeting settings before they join the call. So that can be a little bit of a hurdle with a new student that you should just be aware of. You have to have them leave the call, enable the meeting settings, come back into the call, and then when they're in the call, enable the settings a second time. So that can be a loophole, but again, these are all things you learn over time. You can just kind of mitigate problems ahead of time. Whew, that's a lot to talk about. The reliability of messaging is very important for students. You have to stay congruent to your brand and your mission as a private teacher. If your goal is to teach a specific kind of student doing a specific kind of thing, you need to stay within that as best as possible so you can build a reputation for doing that well. Remember, parents and students are looking to buy a product, and that product is a certain type of education that you are promising. So you have to stay on message. If you are committing to building a studio, it becomes very challenging if you're constantly canceling lessons or constantly prioritizing gigs or other things above your lessons. If your goal is to teach so that you can continue practicing and eventually not teach, that is a different level of commitment to building a studio than deciding you want to teach because it's important to you and it's something you want to do long term. So having that honest conversation with yourself will help you determine how committed to this you're actually going to be. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being an orchestral musician that teaches on the side and cancels lessons all the time because you get gigs. I think that's fine. But I do think to some degree, there comes a point where you have to be willing to say no to certain gigs because you are being reliable to your students. If you teach 20 hours a week, you can't just always take gigs because you won't have enough time to reschedule lessons. And if your function of teaching lessons is to only support your gigging, and gigging always comes first, that's something that parents and students deserve to know on the front end. So having that conversation up front is important. Now, the other side of the coin, it is important that your students see you working. Teachers should also be performers. So if you are an orchestral musician and you are trying to gig and you're teaching, it's important that your students know that because they should see you succeeding. It helps add credence to your brand, but it also helps them understand that what you are teaching them to do will get them somewhere. I think there's a fine balance here and you have to kind of figure it out. But by and large, I try and allow myself a maximum of 3 gigs a month. I don't, like when I say gigs, I mean like if you get called for a regional orchestra that plays 3 days out of that week, that would be a gig. So I'm not doing more than one of those hits a week for 3 out of 4 weeks. That's my maximum. And usually I'll do it every other week. I build a single day into my schedule with makeup lessons. And those days are for makeups. While we talk about makeup lessons, different teachers have different policies here. If a student cancels a lesson more than 24 hours ahead of time in Trombone Guide Studios, and then they want a makeup time, I give them the makeup time, and that makeup is charged as their lesson. If a student screws up and cancels at last minute, and I have a makeup time already set, and they take that time, they're going to pay me for the lesson that they canceled because they canceled too late. But I'm not going to charge them for the makeup because the makeup already exists in my schedule as a makeup time. Now, many people will take issue with this and say, no, you're giving them 2 hours. You need to charge them twice. I probably should, but I have found that this is not a recipe for success in building a studio. Students don't really understand that kind of takes advantage of your time, and they're well-meaning in the sense that they're not trying to cheat you out of your money. They just don't have an understanding of that yet if they're younger students. And when I say younger students, I mean students under the age of 22. I have found that by and large, it's really difficult to uphold this rule and charge twice. Ethically, I feel weird about it. That's not to say that you shouldn't, but for me, it is not what I've come up with. And I've tried. I just don't like it as much. Now, if a student is constantly canceling lessons and you haven't cut them from your studio because they're continually canceling, yeah, maybe you charge them twice, and that's fine. One more word about this, and this is about payment in general. I want to talk about late paying. My students owe me money up to and within 24 hours of the lesson. So if I teach them on a Thursday at noon, they have to pay me by Friday at 11:59. If that money does not come in by then, their payment is late, and I charge a late fee that is pretty steep. I charge $27 as a late fee, which is, more than 25% of their lesson cost. I do this to dissuade students from paying late. But occasionally, students have no control over whether they pay late or not, particularly younger students. It's important to understand that I struggled with this for a while because I felt like I was grifting my students in defending my time. But I had a friend explain it to me in a different way. And the reality is that people pay things late for all sorts of reasons in life, and adults make those decisions. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with charging someone a late fee if they choose to pay something late. There could be a myriad of reasons that they're doing that, and then that's their decision. You don't want to take that freedom from them. They get to make that choice with their money. As a caveat to this, I think that if a student communicates healthily to you that they're going to be late with their payment for any reason, things come up in life, I don't charge them any late fee, and you shouldn't either. Try to be as understanding with students as you can, because life gets in the way. Sometimes there's medical bills, sometimes families having a tough go for some reason or another. Like, that can happen. There's nothing wrong with that. A couple words about recruiting before I land this plane here. I have found that there are good times and bad times to recruit students for your studio. There are times where students are open to looking for lessons. There are times where they are not. The times that are not successful are at the beginning of the summer, which is frustrating for teachers because that's a great time to add students to your studio, because you have 3 months over the summer where you can make meaningful gains with a student before they go back to school. It's a great time for a student to take lessons. The problem is students aren't thinking about lessons when they go off to the summer. They're thinking about the summer. Particularly for middle school and high school students, they are not thinking about getting into lessons in May. So if you are hoping to try and add students in May because you're graduating students, you're losing students, this is not the best time to add students. I have found that March and April are far better times to communicate with students, because these are periods where students are in the grind. They're in the middle of auditions for either colleges, but also for district and all-state type things in different states, depending on where they're located. This is a good time. September. September is late August and September are good times to add students to your studio because they're just getting back into the swing of things. December into January, late December, early January is a pretty good time to add students to your studio because they're looking to make changes in the new year. Outside of that, I think it's difficult to add students. So you need to plan accordingly to make sure that that helps you guide your hand in a healthy way. At the end of the day, you want to keep your life as balanced as possible. You're not just a teacher. You're not just a musician. You have other things in your life. And in the first years of teaching and building a studio, it can be, well, very frustrating because you feel like you're just pouring yourself into trying to build this teaching apparatus and you're not making a lot of money doing it. And that can be really frustrating. I promise you, you will get to a point where the machine starts to build itself. It just takes time and it takes commitment. And those first years are difficult, like any other profession. The first few years are very challenging. So to those of you that are, I'm happy to share all of my secrets here. I think it's important that everybody understand that the lesson structure that I built is not unique in the sense that I'm the only person that can do it. Any of you can do it. It just was a commitment that I made to try and do, and this is how I did it. So I hope that that's not too boring a topic, but I was excited to talk about it. And for those of you that are looking to get into teaching, you can always reach out to me, tromboneguide@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer any of your personal questions, and happy practicing.